Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
"Plenty of food, remember, Mr. Goodman," said the doctor. "You must make sure your wife follows my advice. And you, my dear lady, don't worry about not feeling hungry. You'll feel hungry again soon if you do what I say. Good afternoon." Little Grace Goodman watched the doctor leave. When the door closed behind him and her father, she turned to her mother. Mrs. Goodman looked very pale and sick. She lay back in her soft chair, trying to hide a tear. But Grace noticed and ran to hug her mother tightly. "Oh, Mother, are you very sad?" she asked, her own lip trembling. "No, no, my darling, not very sad," answered her mother, kissing her gently. "Shh, don't cry, my love, or you'll make father sad. Here he comes." Mr. Goodman came back into the room, looking thoughtful. But as he sat down beside his wife, he smiled and said cheerfully, "You'll be well soon, the doctor says. The worst is over, and you just need to get stronger." Mrs. Goodman smiled sadly. "He doesn't know how hard it is to do what he says," she said. "Not impossible. I think we can do it," he replied. A sudden spark of hope appeared in the sick lady's eyes. "Has the book been accepted?" she asked eagerly. "The book? No, not at all. The publishers all said no. It's risky to publish such an expensive book, you see, so I'm not surprised they refused." "How will we get the money then?" asked his wife. "We barely have enough for our everyday needs, and we can't spare any for extra things. We'll have to sell something." Mrs. Goodman looked around the poorly furnished room, then back at her husband with a questioning look. "We'll have to sell Uncle Jacob's Indian cabinet," he said. Mrs. Goodman quickly looked at a big black piece of furniture in a dark corner of the room, and after a short pause, she said, "I don't want to give it away. It might be silly and superstitious, but I always feel it's not wise to forget what Uncle Jacob said about it in his will." "I don't remember much," her husband replied. "I vaguely recall he said something about the cabinet bringing good luck. I didn't pay attention because I don't believe in such things. Besides, Uncle Jacob was peculiar. His odd ideas were hard to understand." "Yes, he was strange, but I don't think he was unintelligent. He had unusual ideas from his time in India, but he was clear-headed about practical matters." "What did he say about the Indian cabinet?" "He said he left it to us because we didn't need his money then," Mrs. Goodman explained. "He called it the magic cabinet. He claimed it belonged to a rich Raja before, who got it from a wise Buddhist priest. Uncle Jacob believed it had special powers to protect its owners from bad luck. He warned against ever getting rid of it." Mr. Goodman chuckled nervously. "I wonder what Uncle Jacob would think now," he mused. "He wrote all that fanciful stuff in his will, never imagining we'd be in such need. He didn't believe in my book, but he couldn't predict the bank's failure and losing all our money. If he were here now, I doubt he'd advise keeping the cabinet while you lack the nourishment the doctor recommends." Mrs. Goodman sighed. "I guess we have no choice," she replied. "The cabinet must go. I can't help without strength, and I don't want to make things harder for you." Little Grace had been watching her parents intently. Now she exclaimed, "Oh, Mother, do we have to take away the dear old black cabinet? Will we never see it again?" Her father sat her between his legs and smoothed her soft golden hair. "I know you'll miss it, dear," he said gently. "You've had such fun playing with it, haven't you? But you'll be happy to give it up if it helps make your mother better." "Will Mom be all better when the cabinet is gone?" Grace asked. "Will her face be bright and pink again? And will she go outside?" "Yes, sweetheart, I hope so. I'm going to ask someone to take the cabinet away now. While I'm gone, I want Mom to rest, so you need to be quiet." "Yes, I will," Grace promised. "I need to say goodbye to the cabinet." With that, she dashed to the corner where the cabinet stood. Mr. Goodman kissed his wife's pale face tenderly, whispered words of hope to her, then left the room. The sound of the house door closing echoed a moment later. As twilight filled the room, Mrs. Goodman drifted into a peaceful sleep. But Grace remained seated on the floor, staring at the Indian cabinet. It was a big and beautiful black cabinet made of ebony, shining brightly. The doors in front were decorated with intricate carvings and delicate silver patterns. Grace loved these carvings. They were like her storybooks and toys since she was very young, and she knew every detail by heart. All the animals and designs were familiar to her, but right now, she wasn't paying much attention to them. Her mind was on the main carving in the center, split between the two doors. This central carving showed an Indian temple with tall towers and domes. In front of the temple door sat a serious-looking Indian priest. This priest was Grace's favorite toy. As she looked at him, tears welled up in her eyes at the thought of saying goodbye. He was a charming little figure. His beard was made of shiny silver wire, his eyes were tiny ivory dots, and he held a small gold bar, which acted as the latch for the cabinet doors. Grace stared at the priest affectionately for a long time. Finally, she scooted a bit closer to the cabinet and whispered, "I don't want to say goodbye at all. I wish you could stay if you wanted. Maybe you could help my mom get better in another way? Since you're from a magical cabinet, you must be a magical priest too, right? You can do amazing things if you want." The priest nodded seriously. This surprised Grace, and she jumped back, looking a bit scared. It was fun to pretend that the little wooden figure was a real magic priest when she played, but it was different to see it nodding at her. Feeling puzzled, Grace cautiously approached the cabinet again and whispered, "Did you nod just now?" The ebony priest bowed its head almost to the ground. Now Grace was sure. He was a magical priest after all. She wasn't scared anymore. A feeling of happiness started to grow in her heart, and she said, "Oh, I'm so happy. You won't leave us, will you?" For a moment, the figure stayed still. Then it vigorously shook its head, making the silver beard sway from side to side. "Oh, you're such a sweet old thing," Grace exclaimed happily. "But you know how sick my poor mom is, and she really needs nice things to make her stronger. You'll have to get them for her if you stay, you know." Once again, the priest nodded seriously. "It's not easy," Grace warned, raising her finger. "My dad is really smart, but even he can't always do it. He wrote a big book, lots and lots of pages, but that didn't work either. I don't think you could write a book." The priest remained motionless, and Grace thought his face looked even more serious, maybe even a little upset. Quickly, she added, "Please don't be mad. I didn't mean to be rude. I know you must be very magical to nod your head like that, but can you really get everything the doctor wants for Mom?" Once again, the priest nodded, this time more emphatically than before. Little Grace clapped her hands softly. "Oh, please start now," she whispered, coaxing the figure. Very slowly, as if his joints were stiff, the priest raised his arms, allowing the golden bar in his hands to rotate in a half circle. Then, the Indian temple split down the middle, and the two doors of the magic cabinet swung wide open. Grace lost sight of the little priest, the temple, and all the other wonderful carvings as the folding doors rolled back on their hinges. She peered into the cabinet, wondering what would happen next. Although she had seen the inside of the cabinet before, with its beautiful design, it wasn't new to her, and she felt a little disappointed. Half of the space was filled with tiny drawers and cupboards covered with thin sheets of mother-of-pearl, glowing with soft pink and blue hues. The other half was empty, and the ebony was so polished that the open space looked like a shiny black marble cave. For a few moments, the little girl sat quietly, looking into the depths of the cabinet. But as nothing happened, she stood up, moved closer, and put her head and half her body inside. Everything seemed very dark, and she felt more disappointed than ever. However, just as she was about to pull her head out, she noticed a shining spot in one of the top corners at the back of the cabinet. She had seen it before and always wanted to take a closer look. But the cabinet stood on carved feet, like an alligator's claws, and Grace's outstretched hand couldn't reach the back. Now that the cabinet might be taken away, she felt she couldn't wait any longer. She quickly fetched the highest stool from under the table and placed it in front of the dark opening. Climbing onto it, she entered the open space, and a moment later, she was sitting on the ebony floor of the magic cabinet. It was a bit of a tight fit, but Grace didn't mind at all. She pulled her feet close to her and laughed with joy. Now, she could clearly see the shining speck. It was just a small bright spot in the middle of a dull metal knob. The knob looked plain and uninteresting, and it was fixed so high up in the dark corner that she wouldn't have noticed it if it hadn't been for the bright spot. Curious about the knob's purpose, Grace gave it a sharp tug, but it wouldn't budge. Then she pushed it, and suddenly, bang! The folding doors slammed shut, plunging everything into darkness, and Grace found herself trapped inside the magic cabinet. For a moment, she was too startled to move. But when she regained her composure, instead of trying to open the cabinet doors, she felt around for the small metal knob again and pushed it with all her strength. There was a sharp snap, like a lock turning, and then a harsh, scraping sound as the back of the cabinet slowly slid aside, revealing, guess what? The wall of the room behind? A hidden cupboard? No, it wasn't either of those. As soon as the back of the cabinet slid aside, a sudden and dazzling flash of light blinded Grace momentarily, and she had to shield her eyes with her hands. But soon she couldn't resist peeking between her fingers, and she nearly cried out with joy. Before her eyes was a scene straight out of a fairy tale, but it wasn't just a picture. It looked as real as it was beautiful. Instead of sitting in a dark cabinet, Grace found herself perched on the top step of a marble staircase leading down to a shimmering lake. The lake, dotted with graceful swans gliding among the lilies, stretched out before her. Along its banks, among flower-covered trees and bushes, stood grand palaces and temples, their golden domes and marble terraces gleaming in the sunlight. Grace took in this enchanting sight with a single delighted glance, but she was soon taken aback by an even greater surprise. Grace's eyes widened in amazement as she saw a magnificent boat gliding gracefully over the sparkling lake. It shimmered with a pearly sheen, and as the breeze filled its sails made of purple silk, it sailed closer to the steps. Grace couldn't contain her excitement and leaped to her feet. A tall man with a white beard stood at the boat's prow, waving a long golden wand above his head. Grace clapped her hands with joy. "It's my dear Indian priest from the cabinet door," she exclaimed. "But he's grown so tall and handsome." Before she could utter another word, the pearly boat sailed up beside the bottom step, and the old man gestured for her to come down. Without hesitation, Grace scampered down the stairs and leaped into his welcoming arms. "You're such a dear, kind magic priest to come," she said, settling into a cozy spot on some cushions at the boat's bottom. "And this place is so lovely. Do you live here?" "Sometimes," the old man replied with a solemn smile. "Oh, right, I forgot. Sometimes you live on the door of the magic cabinet. You've been there for as long as I can remember, sitting in front of the little carved temple. Don't you get bored there sometimes?" "How do you know I don't leave while you're asleep?" "I never thought of that," said Grace. "But please tell me, where is the magic cabinet now?" The old priest was busy adjusting the sails of the boat, which was now swiftly departing from the shore. But upon hearing the question, he looked up and pointed towards the top of the steps with his golden wand. Grace followed his gaze and spotted a beautiful little temple made of inlaid colored marbles. "Is that really the back of our dear old black cabinet?" she exclaimed. "How pretty it is! I wonder why we've never discovered it before." "Everything has two sides," said the old man, "and one is always more beautiful than the other, and Strangely, the best side is often hidden. It can always be found if people wish for it, but usually they don't bother. Grace gazed earnestly at the priest's face while he spoke, and after he finished, she remained silent for so long that he eventually asked, "What are you thinking about?" "I was thinking about your face," she replied. "You won't think me rude, will you?" "No, certainly not." "Well, you're just my dear old Indian priest, with the strange, dark face and nice white beard, exactly as I've always known you, only much bigger and taller, and I'm sure that long wand is much fancier than the little gold bar you usually hold. But I can't help but think you're a little like my mother's Uncle Jacob, who left us the magic cabinet. I've often looked at his picture in the album, and your eyes have a similar look. Do you mind?" "Not at all," answered the old man, smiling kindly. Then he returned to adjusting the sails because the boat was approaching a small island. "Are we getting off here?" asked Grace. "Yes, you want me to do something for you, don't you?" And then, without waiting for an answer, he pulled some silken cords, which folded up the purple sails like the wings of a resting bird. The boat grounded gently on a mossy bank, without the slightest shock. Taking the little girl in his arms, the old man jumped ashore. Bright flowers and ripe fruits grew abundantly on this fairy-like island, and birds of gorgeous plumage flew around, filling the sunny air with music. But the old priest seemed not to notice any of these things. He led Grace by the hand up the mossy bank and through a thicket of flowering shrubs into a glade, where he stopped and asked, "Now, what is it to be?" "Oh, I can't decide," said Grace, eagerly looking up into his face. "You know I want Mother to be completely well, and I don't want you or the magic cabinet to leave us. But I don't know what you should do. Please, please do whatever you think is best. I know it will be nice." The old priest smiled and struck the ground with his golden wand. There was such a noise that Grace had to cover her ears, and at the same time, a great red brick house rose from the ground at a little distance, with twisted chimneys and overhanging gable ends. Grace stared with astonishment from the house to the smiling priest. Finally, she exclaimed, "Why, it's our old home where we used to live before we became so poor. I must be asleep and dreaming." "Well, even if you are, don't you like the dream?" asked her old friend. "Yes, yes, it's a beautiful dream. It can't be real," said Grace, quickly adding, "Can we go inside the house?" "Yes, if you'd like," he answered, taking her hand and leading her up the steps and through the doorway.